Kiss me.
2 words whispered so softly that Ethan Harper almost convinced himself he had imagined them. The ballroom erupted around them in cheers and confetti as the clock struck midnight, but in that moment, everything else faded to silence. Victoria Hayes stood before him in a crimson-red dress that caught every light in the room, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist, her green eyes holding his, with an intensity that made his heart forget how to beat. For 5 years, Ethan had stood on the sidelines of life, watching other couples share midnight kisses, while he clutched his grief like a shield. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that love was something that happened once, that his chance had come and gone with his wife's last breath. But now, with Victoria's perfume wrapping around him like a promise and her whispered invitation hanging in the air between them, he realized that everything he believed might have been wrong. What Ethan didn't know yet was that this moment almost never happened. It took a tragedy that shattered his world, a woman carrying her own invisible scars, and a 5-year-old girl who claimed to speak with angels to bring them to this exact second in time. And what happened after that kiss would change 3 lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The fluorescent lights in the delivery room had always seemed harsh to Ethan, but on December 26th, 5 years before that fateful New Year's Eve party, they felt absolutely merciless. They illuminated everything with a clinical brightness that left no room for shadows, no place for hope to hide when things started going wrong. Lauren had been laughing just 20 minutes earlier. Her dark curls were plastered to her forehead with sweat, and she had squeezed Ethan's hand so tightly during contractions that he was certain she would break his fingers. But she had been laughing. She kept saying that their daughter was already stubborn, just like her father refusing to arrive on her due date and making them spend Christmas in the hospital instead of at home by the tree they had decorated together. Ethan remembered the exact moment when the laughter stopped. He remembered the way the steady beeping of the monitors suddenly changed pitch, becoming urgent and alarming. He remembered how the nurse's calm expression shifted into something professional and controlled the kind of look that medical staff wore when they were trying not to frighten the patient. He remembered Lauren's grip on his hand loosening as her face went pale, and he remembered the single word she managed to whisper before everything descended into chaos. Ethan, just his name, just the way she always said it with that little lift at the end that made it sound like a question and an answer all at once. But there was something in her voice that he had never heard before, something that sounded terrifyingly like goodbye. Then the room flooded with people in scrubs, and someone was pushing him toward the door, and he was shouting Lauren's name, even as they told him he needed to wait outside, that they would take care of her, that everything would be fine. The last thing he saw before the door closed was Lauren's dark eyes finding his across the room, and in them he saw everything they had built together, and everything they had planned for their future, and he saw her trying to tell him something that words couldn't capture. The waiting room chairs were made of hard plastic designed to be durable rather than comfortable, and Ethan sat in one without really registering that he had moved. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into hours or collapsed into seconds, he couldn't tell which. Other families came and went, some crying with joy, others simply crying, and Ethan sat frozen in the center of it, all his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When the doctor finally appeared, Ethan knew before a single word was spoken. He knew from the way the man's shoulders slumped, from the way he couldn't quite meet Ethan's eyes, from the weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the vicinity. The words that followed were just confirmation of what Ethan's heart had already understood. "Mr. Harper, I'm so sorry. We did everything we could." The explanation came in fragments that Ethan only half heard. Complications. Hemorrhage. They had tried everything. They had worked on her for over an hour. She never regained consciousness. "Your daughter is healthy. We're so sorry. We're so very sorry. Your daughter is healthy." Those 4 words penetrated the fog of shock that had descended over Ethan's mind. A daughter. Lauren had given birth to their daughter. And then Lauren had died. The nurse who led him to the nursery was kind, in the way that only people who deal with tragedy every day can be kind, with a gentleness that expected nothing in return. She didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes or empty comfort. She simply walked beside him through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past rooms filled with new families experiencing the greatest joy of their lives until they reached a window looking into a room filled with small, clear bassinets. "She's the one on the right," the nurse said softly. "The one with the pink bow. We didn't have a name yet for the records, so she's listed as Baby Girl Harper." Ethan stepped closer to the glass, and for a moment, his grief was pierced by something else entirely. She was so small, so impossibly incredibly small. Her tiny fists were curled near her face, and she had dark hair just like Lauren's, a soft covering of dark curls that looked almost comical on someone so new to the world. Her eyes were closed in sleep, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had no idea that the world had just become a much colder place. "Would you like to hold her?" Ethan nodded without speaking, because speaking felt impossible, and the nurse led him into the room and helped him settle into a rocking chair, and then placed his daughter in his arms for the first time. The weight of her was nothing and everything at once. She weighed practically nothing in physical terms, just a few pounds of fragile new life, but emotionally, she weighed more than Ethan could bear. He looked down at her face, searching for Lauren in her features, and he found her in the shape of the baby's nose, in the curve of her tiny lips, in those dark curls that would probably drive them both crazy as she grew older. Then the baby opened her eyes. They were blue the way all newborns' eyes are blue, but there was something in them that seemed ancient and knowing, as if she understood far more than any infant should. She looked up at Ethan, and he could swear she was really seeing him, really connecting with him across the vast divide between what he had lost and what he had just gained. "Lauren." He whispered, his voice breaking on his wife's name. "I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to be what she needs. I was supposed to be the fun dad, remember? You were supposed to handle the hard stuff. You were supposed to teach her how to braid her hair and bake cookies and deal with her first heartbreak. What am I supposed to do now?" The baby made a small sound, something between a coo and a sigh, and one of her tiny hands unfurled and seemed to reach toward his face. Ethan caught her fingers in his own, marveling at how small they were, how delicate, how absolutely dependent on him for everything. "Sophie," he said. Suddenly, the name coming to him from somewhere deep in his memory. Lauren had suggested it months ago during one of their late-night conversations about the future. If it's a girl, she had said, "I want to name her Sophie. It means wisdom, and God knows our kid is going to need plenty of that with us as parents." "Your name is Sophie, Ethan," told his daughter, tears streaming down his face. "Sophie Lauren Harper, and I'm going to try to be enough for you, even though I have no idea how. I'm going to try every single day for the rest of my life." He was still holding Sophie, still making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, when the door opened and Lauren's mother walked in. Margaret Collins had aged 10 years in the space of a few hours. Her face was ravaged by grief, her eyes swollen from crying, and when she saw Ethan holding the baby, something complicated passed across her expression. Pain, love, anger, fear, all of it mixed together into an emotion that didn't have a name. "Is that her?" Margaret's voice cracked on the words. Ethan nodded, shifting Sophie slightly so that Margaret could see her face. "Her name is Sophie." Lauren wanted her to be named Sophie. Margaret stepped closer, her hand reaching out, trembling toward the baby. then stopping halfway, as if she was afraid of what touching Sophie might mean. For a long moment, she just looked at her granddaughter, and Ethan could see the war happening behind her eyes. This baby was the last piece of Lauren. This baby was also the reason Lauren was gone. How do you love something and resent it at the same time? How do you hold something that represents both your greatest joy and your greatest loss? She has Lauren's hair, Margaret finally said, and then she broke down completely sobbing with a grief so raw that Ethan felt his own tears start fresh. They stayed like that for a long time, the two of them crying together, while Sophie slept peacefully in Ethan's arms, completely unaware that she had entered a world that would never be quite complete without the woman who had given her life. The first year of Sophie's life was something that Ethan survived more than lived through. Later, when people asked him about it, he would find that large portions of that time existed in his memory only as vague impressions, feelings without concrete details, like trying to remember a dream after waking. He remembered the exhaustion most clearly, the bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that came from being the sole caretaker of a newborn, while also drowning in grief. Sophie woke every 2 to 3 hours for the first few months, and each time her cries pulled him from whatever fitful sleep he had managed to achieve, Ethan would stumble to her crib, in a daze, going through the motions of feeding and changing and rocking, while his mind remained somewhere else entirely, somewhere back in that hospital room where he had lost everything. The formula was a constant battle in those early days. Lauren had planned to breastfeed, and they had never really discussed alternatives, so Ethan found himself standing in the baby aisle of the grocery store 3 days after bringing Sophie home, staring at rows of identical cans and having no idea which one to choose. He must have stood there for 20 minutes, completely paralyzed by indecision, until a woman with a toddler in her cart gently suggested a brand that her pediatrician had recommended. He thanked her and grabbed the can without really registering what he was doing, and he didn't realize until he got home that he was crying. Margaret was a complicated presence during those months. She came by almost every day, unable to stay away from her only grandchild. But her relationship with Sophie remained strained in ways that Ethan could see, even if Sophie couldn't. Sometimes Margaret would hold the baby, and her face would soften into pure love, and Ethan would glimpse the grandmother she could have been in a different world. But other times, Margaret would look at Sophie and something would close off in her expression, a door slamming shut against an emotion she couldn't handle, and she would hand the baby back to Ethan with some excuse about needing to leave. Ethan understood in an abstract way what Margaret was going through. Sophie's birth and Lauren's death were inseparable events, connected forever in the worst possible way. Every time Margaret looked at her granddaughter, she was reminded of what that arrival had cost. The guilt Margaret felt for those complicated feelings only made everything worse, creating a spiral of emotion that none of them knew how to break. But slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. Ethan couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the change happened, but somewhere around Sophie's 4th month of life, he noticed that Margaret was staying longer during her visits. She was holding Sophie more often, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. She was telling the baby stories about Lauren, about when Lauren was a little girl herself, about all the adventures they had shared as a family. And Sophie, in the mysterious way that babies sometimes do, seemed to respond to her grandmother in a way that broke through all of Margaret's complicated feelings. She would smile her gummy smile whenever Margaret appeared, would reach for her with chubby hands, would fall asleep most peacefully when Margaret sang the lullabies she had once sung to Lauren. Somehow, this tiny person who had never met her mother was building a bridge between the living and the dead, connecting Margaret to Lauren in a new way that neither of them could have predicted. By Sophie's 1st birthday, the 3 of them had settled into something that resembled a functional, if unconventional, family unit. Margaret had stopped looking at Sophie with complicated eyes and had started looking at her with uncomplicated love. Ethan had learned to function on minimal sleep and to find moments of joy in Sophie's small accomplishments, her first tooth, her first word, her first wobbly steps while holding on to the coffee table. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it had become something he carried rather than something that crushed him. It was around this time that Ethan's career became a serious problem. He had been working at Pinnacle Marketing as a senior accountant when Lauren died, a good job with a comfortable salary that had allowed them to afford their modest apartment and plan for their future family. But the demands of single parenthood were incompatible with the expectations of his position. He was always leaving early for daycare pickup, always calling in sick when Sophie had a fever, always distracted during meetings because he was worried about whether he had packed enough diapers in the diaper bag. His supervisor, a man named Gerald, who had never once asked about Sophie's well-being, called him into a conference room on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other morning of that impossible year. Gerald informed him that his performance had been slipping, that the company needed people who could commit fully to their roles, and that perhaps Ethan should consider whether this job was still the right fit for him. Ethan sat in that conference room, listening to words that amounted to a suggestion that he resign, and he felt the last of his hope draining away. Without this job, he couldn't afford the apartment. Without the apartment, he would have to move in with Margaret, and as much as he loved his mother-in-law, the idea of losing the last vestiges of his independence felt like losing Lauren all over again. Without his independence, what was left? What kind of life could he possibly build for Sophie if he couldn't even keep a job? He was composing his resignation letter in his head, trying to figure out how to phrase it with some shred of dignity, when there was a knock on the conference room door, and Victoria Hayes walked in. Ethan had seen the new CEO around the office, of course. Everyone had. Victoria had been promoted to the position just 3 months earlier, the youngest CEO in the company's history at 36 years old. She was known for being brilliant, demanding, and completely focused on results. She had turned around 2 failing departments within her first month, and the entire company seemed to hold its breath whenever she walked by, waiting to see who would be next to feel her attention. What Ethan had not expected was for Victoria Hayes to look at Gerald with barely concealed contempt, dismiss him from his own conference room with a single pointed glance, and then sit down across from Ethan with his resignation letter draft pulled up on her tablet. "I understand you're planning to resign," Victoria said, and her voice was surprisingly warm compared to her professional reputation. "I'd like to discuss some alternatives before you make that decision final." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Gerald just suggested that my performance hasn't been acceptable. Gerald suggested a lot of things that I don't agree with." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Ethan with eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "I've been reviewing performance metrics for the entire accounting department. Your work when you're actually here to do it is excellent. Your error rate is the lowest on the team. Your analysis is insightful and thorough. The problem isn't your abilities. The problem is that you have an 11-month-old daughter at home and no flexibility in your schedule. That's not exactly a problem that has a solution," Ethan said carefully. "Sophie needs me. I can't just—" "I'm aware of what happened to your wife," Victoria interrupted gently. "The entire office knows. What I don't understand is why no one thought to adjust your situation accordingly." She reached across the table and took the resignation letter, tearing it in half, with a decisive motion that made Ethan's breath catch. "Here's what's going to happen," Victoria continued. "I'm moving you to a flexible schedule. You'll work from home 2 days a week and adjust your in-office hours around your daughter's daycare schedule. Your core responsibilities will remain the same, but the when and where will accommodate your life instead of the other way around." Ethan stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. "You can't just do that." "Company policy." Company policy works for me, not the other way around, Victoria said with the slightest hint of a smile. I'm the CEO, Mr. Harper. If I say flexible arrangements are good for productivity and retention, then that becomes company policy. Your case will be the pilot program. Why the word escaped before Ethan could stop it. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like recognition. Because I know what it's like to have everything fall apart and have to rebuild from nothing. Because I believe that taking care of your child makes you a better employee, not a worse one. And because this company needs people who are loyal and dedicated, and those qualities are earned by treating people with basic human decency. She stood smoothing her blazer with practiced hands. Take some time to think about it if you need to, but I hope you'll stay. Pinnacle Marketing needs good people, and you're one of them. She was almost to the door when Ethan found his voice again. Miss Hayes. She turned back. Thank you. I don't know how to just thank you. Victoria nodded once, a small acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey more warmth than words could have. Then she was gone, and Ethan was left sitting in the conference room looking at the torn pieces of his resignation letter and feeling something he hadn't felt in almost a year. Hope. What Ethan didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Victoria Hayes understood his situation far more personally than she had let on. She had her own story, her own wounds, her own reasons for recognizing someone drowning and reaching out to help. 3 years before that meeting in the conference room, Victoria had been standing in the bridal suite of the most expensive venue in the city, wearing a designer wedding dress that had taken 6 months to create. 200 guests were waiting in the ballroom below. Her parents had flown in from Connecticut. Her maid of honor was making final adjustments to her veil. Everything was perfect. Everything except for the text message that arrived 45 minutes before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. Victoria could still remember the exact words, even though she had tried to forget them countless times. She could remember the way her phone had buzzed on the vanity, and how she had assumed it was Richard sending her something sweet. Some final message of love before they began their forever together. She could remember picking up the phone with a smile on her face, expecting poetry or promises. Instead, she found 4 sentences that destroyed everything she had built her future around. I can't do this. I thought I could accept it, but I can't. I found someone who can give me what you can't. I'm sorry. The what you can't was the part that had broken her. Because Victoria knew exactly what he meant. She had known since she was 28 years old when a doctor had sat her down and explained that her endometriosis was severe enough to make natural conception virtually impossible. The chances of carrying a pregnancy to term were less than 5%. IVF might be an option, but even that came with no guarantees and significant risks. She had told Richard everything before they got engaged. She had been completely honest about her diagnosis, about the limitations it placed on their future, about the alternative paths to parenthood they could explore together. Adoption, surrogacy, a life full of love without biological children. Richard had held her hands and looked into her eyes and sworn that none of it mattered, that he wanted her. Not just her ability to reproduce, that they would figure everything out together. He had been lying, or maybe he had believed himself in that moment, and only later realized he couldn't keep that promise. Victoria would never know for certain which version was true, and she had eventually stopped caring. The result was the same either way. She had stood in that bridal suite in her perfect dress with her perfect hair and her perfect makeup, and she had been publicly humiliated in front of everyone she knew and loved. The walk from the bridal suite to the venue's exit had been the longest of her life. 200 pairs of eyes watching her, 200 minds forming assumptions, 200 mouths that would later spread the story across their social circles. The poor woman who got left at the altar, The career woman whose fiancé found someone better. The woman who couldn't give him children. Victoria had not cried in front of any of them. She had held her head high and walked out with her dignity intact, and she had not allowed herself to break down until she was safely in a cab, heading anywhere but home. The driver had been kind enough to pretend he didn't notice her sobbing in the back seat, and she had tipped him excessively in silent gratitude for that small mercy. In the years that followed, Victoria had built walls around her heart so thick and high that nothing could penetrate them. She threw herself into her career with an intensity that bordered on obsessive climbing the corporate ladder with a single-minded focus that left no room for personal entanglements. She dated occasionally just enough to maintain appearances at industry events, but she never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. The CEO position had been her crowning achievement, the proof that she didn't need Richard or anyone else to validate her worth. She had built her own empire, earned her own power, created her own legacy. And if she sometimes lay awake at night, wondering what it would feel like to have someone reach for her in the darkness that was a weakness she never allowed to show. Then she had started noticing Ethan Harper. It wasn't romantic at first. Not consciously, anyway. She noticed him because he was drowning, and she recognized the particular way a person looks when they're trying desperately to stay afloat while everything around them is pulling them under. She noticed him because he reminded her of herself in those months after the wedding that never was, when she had gone through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. And she noticed him because of Sophie. The first time Ethan brought Sophie to the office, Victoria had been walking through the main floor when she heard a child's voice, which was unusual enough to catch her attention. She had turned to see Ethan at his desk, looking frazzled and apologetic, while a little girl with dark curly hair sat in his lap, crayoning something on printer paper with intense concentration. Victoria had intended to just walk past to maintain the professional distance that a CEO was supposed to maintain, but something about the scene stopped her in her tracks. The little girl looked up, noticed Victoria watching, and her face split into a bright smile. "Hi, I'm Sophie. Are you my daddy's friend?" Ethan had looked mortified. "Sophie, that's Miss Hayes. She's the boss. She's very important and very busy." "That's okay," Sophie had said with the confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned to be intimidated by authority. "Important people need friends, too. Do you want to see my butterfly?" She held up her paper, which was covered in colorful circles and swooping lines that were presumably meant to represent butterflies. Victoria found herself smiling before she could stop herself. "Those are beautiful butterflies, Sophie. They're magic," Sophie explained seriously. "Mommy sends them to me. She's in heaven, but she sends butterflies, so I know she's watching." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. This child, this motherless child who couldn't be more than 3 or 4, was talking about death and heaven and loss with the casual acceptance of someone who had simply absorbed these concepts as part of her normal reality. "I'm sure she is," Victoria had heard herself say. "Watching you all the time." And then, without fully understanding why she was doing it, Victoria had rolled up her sleeve and shown Sophie the small butterfly tattoo on the inside of her wrist. "My mommy is in heaven too," Victoria said softly. "She gave me this before she went, so I would always remember that butterflies carry messages between people who love each other even when they're far apart." Sophie's eyes had gone wide with wonder. "Your mommy knew about the butterfly secret too." "She did. Maybe our mommies are friends up there. Maybe they talk about us and tell each other stories." Victoria had not been able to respond to that. Her throat had closed up with an emotion she hadn't felt in years, something dangerous and vulnerable and completely inappropriate for the workplace. She had excused herself, quickly retreating to her office where she could compose herself behind closed doors. But she never forgot that conversation. And she never stopped noticing Ethan and Sophie after that day. Now, 3 years later, Victoria sat in her corner office overlooking the city skyline and allowed herself to acknowledge something she had been avoiding for a very long time. Her feelings for Ethan Harper had evolved far beyond professional concern. She thought about him constantly, found excuses to check in on his projects, lit up inside whenever his name appeared in her inbox. She sent Sophie birthday presents and holiday cards, told herself it was just because she cared about employee morale, knew that was a lie. She was falling in love with him. The realization terrified her. After everything she had been through, after all the walls she had built, the idea of making herself vulnerable again felt like walking toward a cliff edge in the dark. What if he didn't feel the same? What if he did, but couldn't move past his grief for his wife? What if she opened her heart and he broke it, just like Richard had? But there was another fear too, a darker one that Victoria only allowed herself to examine in her most private moments. What if she wasn't capable of being what Ethan and Sophie needed? What if her inability to have children meant she could never be a real part of their family? What if she was just borrowing someone else's life because she couldn't build one of her own? Richard's words echoed in her mind, as they always did when these doubts crept in. I found someone who can give me what you can't. Maybe he had been right. Maybe she wasn't complete. Maybe she never would be. But when Victoria closed her eyes and imagined the future, she didn't see the corner office, or the impressive title, or the retirement account that would eventually make her wealthy. She saw Sophie's butterfly drawings on her refrigerator. She saw Ethan's quiet smile when he talked about his daughter. She saw a family that might not look traditional, but could still be real. The question was whether she would ever find the courage to reach for it. 5 years had passed since that devastating December night when Lauren's heart stopped beating and Sophie's heart began. And in that time, Ethan Harper had somehow managed to build something that resembled a life. Their apartment was small by most standards, just 2 bedrooms in a modest building with a temperamental elevator and neighbors who played music slightly too loud on weekend nights. But Ethan had made it into a home. The walls were covered with Sophie's artwork, a rotating gallery of crayon drawings and finger paintings and construction paper creations that documented her growth from uncertain baby scribbles to increasingly recognizable shapes. Between the artwork, photographs of Lauren smiled down at them from carefully chosen frames, a constant reminder that she was still part of their family, even though she couldn't be there in person. The morning routine had become something Ethan could navigate in his sleep, which was fortunate because he was often still half asleep when it began. Sophie was an early riser, a trait she had definitely not inherited from him, and she would appear at his bedside at approximately 6:15 every morning, with the expectation that the day should begin immediately. "Daddy, wake up. The butterflies are already flying and we're missing them." Ethan would groan and drag himself out of bed, shuffle to the bathroom to make himself somewhat presentable, then make his way to the kitchen where Sophie was already attempting to reach the cereal bowls on the top shelf. What did we say about climbing on the counters? That I shouldn't do it. But sometimes I forget, because my tummy is really hungry. He would lift her down, pour her cereal, start the coffee maker and begin the familiar struggle of taming her wild dark curls into something that vaguely resembled a hairstyle. Ethan had watched approximately 300 YouTube tutorials on little girl hair over the past 5 years, and he still wasn't sure he had really mastered any of them. His braids were always a little lopsided, his ponytails never quite centered, but Sophie didn't seem to mind. She would examine his handiwork in the mirror with the critical eye of a 5-year-old fashion consultant and pronounce it good enough for butterflies to land on, which was apparently her highest compliment. The butterfly obsession had started when Sophie was about 3, and it showed no signs of fading. She saw butterflies everywhere, drew butterflies on everything, and had convinced herself that butterflies were personal messengers from her mother in heaven. Ethan wasn't sure whether to encourage this belief or gently redirect it towards something more grounded in reality. But when Sophie's face lit up at the sight of a butterfly landing on a flower in the park, he couldn't bring himself to take that magic away from her. Besides, sometimes he wondered if she might be right. There had been moments over the years when a butterfly had appeared at exactly the right time when Ethan had been struggling with some parenting crisis or drowning in grief, and a butterfly had landed nearby as if to say that everything would be okay. He didn't believe in heaven, not really, not the way Lauren's mother did. But he believed in his daughter's ability to find comfort where she needed it, and that seemed like enough. It was during breakfast on a cold December morning 3 weeks before Christmas, and exactly 1 month before the company's New Year's Eve party, that Sophie brought up the topic that had been hovering at the edges of Ethan's consciousness for longer than he wanted to admit. "Daddy, do you think Miss Victoria likes butterflies?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "What made you think of Miss Victoria?" Sophie shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child who was clearly hiding something. "Just wondering. She has that butterfly on her arm, remember? The one she showed me." "I remember. So she must like butterflies. That means she and Mommy would be friends, right? Because Mommy loves butterflies, and Miss Victoria has a butterfly mommy too." Ethan took a careful sip of his coffee, buying himself time to formulate a response. It was true that Victoria had shown Sophie her butterfly tattoo years ago during one of the emergency office visits when childcare had fallen through. It was also true that Sophie brought up Victoria's name with increasing frequency, always in contexts that seemed designed to connect Victoria to their family in some way. Miss Victoria and Mommy would probably have been friends. Ethan agreed carefully. They both seemed to understand important things about butterflies. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then, with the conversational whiplash that only small children could master, she asked, "Are you going to kiss someone at the New Year's party?" What Ethan definitely choked on his coffee this time. "Where did you hear about kissing at New Year's?" Grandma was watching a movie where people kissed when the clock went ding ding ding. She said it's a tradition. She said Grandpa used to kiss her every New Year's before he went to heaven. Sophie's expression was completely innocent, as if she hadn't just dropped an emotional bomb into their breakfast conversation. "So will you kiss someone too?" Ethan set down his coffee cup, his appetite suddenly gone. "I don't think so, Pumpkin. Those traditions are for people who are married or dating. But you could date someone." Sophie said it like it was the most obvious solution in the world. "You're a very nice daddy. Someone would want to kiss you." "It's not that simple," Ethan said, hating how inadequate those words felt. "When you love someone and they go away, it's hard to think about loving someone else." Sophie was quiet for a moment, her face scrunched up in that expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something. Then she said with absolute certainty, "Mommy would want you to kiss someone. She told me in my dream." Ethan's breath caught. "You dreamed about Mommy." "I dream about her lots of times. She has really pretty hair like mine, and she smiles a lot and she tells me things." Sophie picked up her spoon and resumed eating her cereal, as if she hadn't just shared something extraordinary. She said your heart has a big woey, and you need special medicine. And she said the medicine is already there, but you're too scared to take it. There were moments in parenting when Ethan felt completely out of his depth, and this was definitely one of them. He had no framework for handling his 5-year-old daughter's prophetic dreams about her dead mother. He had no way to determine whether Sophie was genuinely experiencing something supernatural, or whether she had simply created an imaginary version of Lauren based on the photos and stories that surrounded their daily life. "What else does Mommy say in your dreams?" Ethan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Sophie thought about it. "She says she watches us all the time and she's really proud of me. She says I should eat my vegetables even when I don't want to. And she says you need to stop being sad and start being happy again." Sophie looked up at her father with Lauren's eyes dark and knowing and somehow ancient in her young face. "She says it's okay, Daddy. She wants you to be happy. Later that night, after Sophie had been bathed and read to and kissed and tucked in, Ethan found himself standing in front of the small shrine he had created on his dresser. Lauren's wedding photo, a candle he sometimes lit when he was missing her, the last birthday card she had given him before her pregnancy. He hadn't added anything to this collection in years, but he hadn't removed anything either. It just existed, a permanent reminder of everything he had lost. Is Sophie right? He asked the photograph, feeling somewhat foolish for talking to a picture. Do you want me to move on? Because I don't know how. I don't know how to let someone else into my heart when you're still taking up so much space there. The photograph smiled at him, unchanging, unhelpful. Lauren looked beautiful in that image, frozen forever in a moment of pure happiness, unaware of what the future held. Ethan reached out and touched the frame, tracing the outline of her face with his finger. There's this woman, he admitted the words barely above a whisper. Victoria. You would like her, I think. She's strong and smart, and she's been so good to Sophie and me. She makes me smile, Lauren. Really smile, not just the pretend smiles I put on for other people. And I feel guilty about that. I feel like smiling at someone else means I'm forgetting to be sad about you. The candle flickered, though there was no breeze in the room. Ethan chose to take that as a sign, though, of what he couldn't say. Sophie says you send her messages in dreams. She says you told her I need to be happy. He paused, gathering courage for the question he was afraid to ask. Is that true? Are you really there somewhere? And if you are, is it really okay? The photograph remained silent. The candle burned steadily. Outside the window, the first flakes of December snow began to fall. Ethan didn't receive an answer that night. But for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, loving someone new didn't have to mean loving Lauren any less. Victoria Hayes had never intended to become a fixture in the Harper family's life. In the beginning, she had justified her attention to Ethan as good management practice, taking care of a valuable employee who was going through a difficult time. Then she had justified the birthday gifts for Sophie as building workplace morale and demonstrating that Pinnacle Marketing valued its employees' families. Then she had justified the increasing frequency of her visits to Ethan's desk, her lunch invitations, her offers to help with projects that didn't really require her input as strategic networking with a talented member of her team. But Victoria was too intelligent to maintain those justifications forever. Eventually, she had to admit the truth. She looked forward to seeing Ethan Harper every single day, and she was terrified of what that meant. The first time Sophie had visited her office had been an accident of circumstance. Ethan's regular babysitter had canceled at the last minute. Margaret was out of town visiting relatives, and a critical deadline meant he couldn't miss work. Victoria had been passing through the main floor when she noticed Ethan at his desk, looking more frazzled than usual, with a small person perched in his lap. She should have kept walking. A CEO didn't stop to chat with employees and their children during working hours. But something about the scene had drawn her closer, and by the time she realized what she was doing, Sophie was already showing her the butterfly drawings and talking about messages from heaven. That conversation had haunted Victoria for weeks afterward. This child, with her matter-of-fact acceptance of loss, her cheerful certainty that her mother was watching over her, had somehow cracked something open in Victoria's carefully constructed armor. She remembered being Sophie's age and having similar conversations with her own mother's photograph, whispering secrets and asking questions that never received answers. Victoria's mother had died when Victoria was 7, taken by the same cancer that would eventually claim her grandmother and cause Victoria's doctors to recommend regular screenings for the rest of her life. She remembered the funeral, the casseroles that neighbors brought, the way her father had walked through the weeks that followed like a ghost haunting his own house. She remembered learning very young that love could be taken away without warning, and that the people you depended on most could disappear between one breath and the next. Maybe that was why she had built such high walls around her heart. Maybe that was why she had chosen Richard, partly because he seemed safe, stable, unlikely to leave her the way her mother had. And maybe that was why his betrayal had cut so deep. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had confirmed her worst fears about love and loss and the impossibility of keeping anything precious. But Sophie had made her reconsider everything. There was something about the way Sophie talked about her mother with love, but without despair, with longing, but without hopelessness, that suggested a different kind of relationship with loss. Sophie didn't seem to believe that her mother's death meant she had to stop loving or stop hoping or stop reaching for happiness. She just believed that love continued in different forms, through butterflies and dreams, and the people who showed up to care for her. After that first office visit, Victoria had started sending Sophie small gifts. A butterfly sticker book, a set of drawing supplies, a picture book about a little girl who talked to her grandmother in heaven. Each gift was carefully chosen, nothing too expensive, nothing that would cross the line from thoughtful to inappropriate. Each gift was accompanied by a card wishing Sophie well signed simply from Victoria. Ethan had thanked her for each one, his surprise evident in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. Victoria suspected he was trying to figure out her motives, and she couldn't blame him. She wasn't entirely sure of her motives herself, but the gifts kept coming, and the conversations at the office kept getting longer. And somewhere along the way, Victoria stopped pretending that her interest was purely professional. It happened gradually in small moments that accumulated into something significant. Ethan staying late to finish a project, Victoria bringing him coffee because she happened to be passing by. Sophie's 6th birthday party, an invitation that Victoria probably shouldn't have accepted, but did anyway. Spending an afternoon in a room full of screaming children and feeling happier than she had at any of her professional accomplishments. Quiet conversations in Victoria's office after hours when the building was empty, and their words could be honest in a way they couldn't be during business hours. "You're amazing with her," Ethan had said one evening after Victoria had helped him review a particularly complex budget analysis. Sophie had sent a drawing with him that morning, a butterfly with the words, "For Miss Victoria," written in wobbly letters across the bottom. "She's an amazing kid," Victoria had replied, studying the drawing with more attention than it probably deserved. "You're doing an incredible job, Ethan. Some days I feel like I'm barely holding it together." His voice was raw in a way that made Victoria want to reach across the desk and take his hand. "Some days I look at her, and I'm terrified that I'm screwing everything up, that she's going to grow up and realize I was never enough." "You're enough," Victoria said, with a conviction that surprised them both. "You're more than enough. Sophie adores you, and more importantly, she's happy. Well-adjusted. Kind. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because of you." Their eyes had met across the desk, and something had passed between them that Victoria couldn't name. A recognition, an understanding, a promise that neither of them was ready to acknowledge out loud. Ethan started, but his phone had buzzed with a text from Margaret asking when he would be home, and the moment had passed. Victoria had watched him gather his things and leave, and she had spent the rest of the evening staring at Sophie's butterfly drawing and wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. Now, with Christmas approaching and the New Year's party looming on the calendar like an unavoidable confrontation with her own feelings, Victoria found herself at a crossroads. She could continue as she had been maintaining the careful friendship that kept her close to Ethan without risking rejection. She could pull back, create professional distance, protect herself from the vulnerability that terrified her. Or she could do something she hadn't done since the day Richard's text message shattered her world. She could take a risk. The invitation to the New Year's Eve party sat on her desk, its formal language belying the chaos of emotions it represented. As CEO, she was expected to attend, and mingle with employees and clients. As Victoria, she was terrified of what might happen if she spent an evening watching Ethan across a crowded ballroom, knowing that midnight was approaching and that couples everywhere would be sharing kisses she could only dream about. What if she made a move and he rejected her? What if she revealed her feelings and he looked at her with pity, explaining gently that he could never see her as anything more than his boss? What if she risked everything and lost, just like she had lost with Richard? But what if she didn't risk anything and lost anyway? What if she spent the rest of her life wondering what could have been if she had just been brave enough to try? Victoria picked up the invitation, read it one more time, and made a decision that would change everything. The dreams had started when Sophie was 4 years old, though she didn't fully understand what they meant. Until she was older, in the dreams, her mother was beautiful and kind, and exactly the way Sophie imagined her based on the photographs around their apartment. Lauren had dark curly hair like Sophie's, and she smiled a lot. And when she spoke, her voice was warm and gentle and full of love. The first dream that Sophie remembered clearly happened on a night when her father was particularly sad. She had heard him crying through the wall between their rooms, soft sounds that he was trying to hide, but that she could hear anyway. When she fell asleep, her mother was waiting for her in a garden filled with butterflies. "Hello, sweet girl," Lauren said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "I've been wanting to meet you for such a long time." "Are you my mommy?" Sophie asked, though she already knew the answer. "I am, and I love you so much, Sophie. I watch you every single day, and I'm so proud of the person you're becoming." Sophie reached out to touch her mother's face, and the skin was warm and real under her fingers. "Daddy misses you. He cries when he thinks I'm sleeping." "I know, baby. I miss him too. But I need you to help me with something. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Daddy's heart has a big owie right now. It's been hurting for a long time because he misses me so much. But there's medicine that can help make it better. He's just too scared to take it because he thinks it means he's forgetting about me." "What kind of medicine?" Sophie asked. Lauren smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Sophie had ever seen. "It's not the kind of medicine that comes in a bottle, sweetheart. It's the kind that comes from loving someone new. And I need you to help Daddy understand that it's okay. That loving someone else doesn't mean he loves me any less. Can you tell him that for me?" Sophie woke up the next morning with the dream still vivid in her mind, every detail clear and present in a way that dreams usually weren't. She had tried to tell her father what Mommy said, but the words had gotten jumbled coming out. And Daddy had looked at her with that expression he wore when he didn't quite understand, but didn't want to say so. After that first dream, they kept coming. Not every night, but often enough that Sophie began to look forward to sleep in a way that other children didn't. Her mother showed her things in the dreams, places they visited, together lessons she wanted to teach, messages she wanted Sophie to carry back to the waking world. The messages about Miss Victoria started about a year ago. "Do you see the pretty lady with the butterfly on her arm?" Lauren asked during one dream as they walked through a field of wildflowers. Sophie nodded. "Miss Victoria, she gives me presents sometimes. She makes Daddy smile. She's special," Lauren said. "She's going to be important to you and Daddy. I sent her to you." "You sent her. People who love each other from far away can send help when it's needed." I saw that Daddy's heart was still hurting, that he was so lonely, that he needed someone to remind him how to be happy. So I helped guide Miss Victoria to you both. Sophie thought about this. "Does that mean she's going to be my new mommy?" Lauren's expression was gentle, not sad, but somehow serious. "That depends on whether Daddy is brave enough to let her, and whether she's brave enough to try. They've both been hurt, Sophie. They're both scared of being hurt again. They need you to help them see that love is worth the risk." "How do I do that?" "Just keep being yourself, sweetheart. Keep loving them both. Keep reminding Daddy that I want him to be happy." Lauren reached out and tucked a curl behind Sophie's ear. "And when the time is right, you'll know what to do. Now, In the weeks leading up to Christmas and the New Year's party, the dreams were becoming more frequent and more specific. Lauren seemed excited in a way that Sophie didn't fully understand, as if something important was about to happen. "It's almost time," Lauren said in the most recent dream. "New Year's Eve. That's when everything will change." "What's going to happen?" Sophie asked, but Lauren just smiled mysteriously. "You'll see. Just make sure Daddy knows it's okay. Make sure he knows I want him to be happy, and that loving someone new is exactly what I want for him." Sophie woke from that dream with a sense of mission. She had work to do. Have you ever felt like the universe was guiding you towards something bigger than yourself? Drop a comment below. If you believe our loved ones watch over us, the weeks leading up to the New Year's Eve party were filled with a tension that both Ethan and Victoria felt, but neither of them acknowledged. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of something unspoken. Every glance lasted a beat too long. Every accidental touch sent electricity through both of them that they pretended not to notice. At work, they found excuses to collaborate on projects that didn't really require collaboration. Ethan would deliver reports to Victoria's office in person when an email would have sufficed. Victoria would stop by Ethan's desk to discuss budget details that could have waited for their scheduled meetings. Their colleagues had started to notice exchanging knowing looks across cubicle walls, but neither Ethan nor Victoria seemed aware that their carefully maintained professionalism was fooling no one. One evening a week before Christmas, Ethan stayed late to finish a financial analysis that was due the next morning. The office emptied around him as the hours passed, until the only lights on the entire floor were his desk lamp and the glow from Victoria's corner office. At 9 o'clock, Victoria appeared beside his desk with 2 cups of coffee. "You shouldn't still be here," she said, setting 1 cup in front of him. "Neither should you. The CEO is allowed to work late. It's in the job description." She sat in the chair beside his desk, the one usually reserved for brief conversations with colleagues, and wrapped her hands around her own coffee. "Seriously, though, you've been working yourself into the ground this month. Is everything okay?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and wondered how he had ever managed to convince himself that his feelings for her were purely professional. She was beautiful in the fluorescent office lighting, which should have been impossible. Her blonde hair was escaping from its normally perfect arrangement, falling in soft strands around her face. Her eyes were tired, but kind, focused on him with genuine concern. "Christmas is hard," he admitted. "Sophie keeps asking questions about her mom, and I never know the right answers. She wants to know what Lauren would have thought about things, what presents she would have picked out, what her favorite Christmas songs were, and I want to tell her everything. I want Lauren to feel real to her, but sometimes it just hurts. That makes sense." Victoria's voice was soft. "You're keeping her mother alive for her. That's an incredible gift, even when it's painful. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making it worse, if I'm teaching Sophie to hold on to the past instead of moving forward. If all my memories of Lauren are going to turn Sophie into someone who can't let go." "Sophie seems pretty healthy to me," Victoria said. "Happy. Well-adjusted. She talks about her mom with love, not with sadness. I think you're doing something right." Ethan shook his head. "You always know the right thing to say." "Not always. Just when it comes to you." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Victoria had probably intended. She seemed to realize what she had said, and looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Victoria, I should let you finish your work," she interrupted, standing too quickly. "I didn't mean to distract you. You're not a distraction." Ethan stood too suddenly unwilling to let this moment pass like all the others. "You're never a distraction. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Sophie is asking when you'll be home. She wants to show you the butterfly ornament she made." Victoria smiled, though something had shifted in her expression. "You should go. Sophie's waiting." "Yeah." Ethan gathered his things, unable to articulate why he felt like something important had just slipped away. "Victoria, about what you said, it's fine." "Really?" She was already retreating toward her office, her professional mask firmly back in place. "I'll see you tomorrow." But as Ethan drove home through the December darkness, he couldn't stop thinking about those words. "Just when it comes to you." What had she meant? And why did the thought of it make his heart race in a way it hadn't in 5 years? The almost moment in the office was followed by several days of awkwardness that they both felt but neither addressed. Victoria seemed to be avoiding him scheduling meetings at times she knew he would be busy communicating through email instead of in person. Ethan found himself watching for her in the hallways, hoping for a glimpse that would tell him whether everything was okay. On Christmas Eve, he received a package at home addressed to Sophie. Inside was a beautiful butterfly mobile, handcrafted from wire and colored glass that caught the light and scattered rainbows across the walls. The card said simply, "For Sophie's dreams." Victoria. Sophie was enchanted. She insisted on hanging the mobile above her bed immediately, and that night, she fell asleep, watching the butterflies dance in the moonlight. Ethan sat in the living room long after Sophie was asleep, the card in his hands. Victoria had thought of his daughter, even when they were barely speaking. She had taken the time to find something meaningful, something that connected to Sophie's deepest beliefs about her mother. She had remembered. He pulled out his phone and typed a message. "Sophie loves the mobile. She says the butterflies are dancing just for her. Thank you, Victoria, for everything." The response came quickly, as if Victoria had been waiting. "She deserves beautiful things." "So do you, Ethan." He stared at those words for a long time, unsure how to respond. Finally, he typed, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About a lot of things. Would you want to talk at the party? Really talk, I mean. About everything." The typing indicator appeared and disappeared several times before her response came. "I'd like that." "Merry Christmas, Ethan." "Merry Christmas, Victoria." He set down the phone and looked at the Christmas tree they had decorated together, Sophie and him, with the same ornaments they used every year, plus the new butterfly one she had made at school. Lauren's photo smiled at him from the shelf, illuminated by the soft glow of the Christmas lights. "I think I'm falling in love again," he whispered to the photo, "and I think maybe it's okay." "Sophie says you told her it's okay. I hope that's true. I hope you're watching and you understand. And you're not angry." The lights on the tree seemed to twinkle a little brighter, but that might have been his imagination. The morning of December 31st arrived with a clarity of light that felt almost prophetic. The snow from Christmas had melted and refrozen into a crystalline coating on every surface, making the entire city sparkle as if it had been dusted with diamonds. Ethan stood at his bedroom window, watching the sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that today was going to matter in ways he couldn't yet understand. "Daddy, are you excited about the party?" Sophie had appeared in his doorway, already dressed in her pajamas. Despite the early hour, her dark curls forming a chaotic halo around her sleep-creased face. In her arms, she clutched the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since she was 2. A gift from her grandmother that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and slightly gray. "I'm trying to be," Ethan admitted. "Are you going to be okay with Grandma tonight?" Sophie nodded solemnly, the way she did when she was about to say something she considered very important. "Mommy told me in my dream last night that tonight is special. She said the stars are going to line up just right." Ethan felt the familiar chill that accompanied Sophie's dream reports. "What else did she say?" "She said you need to be brave." Sophie climbed onto his bed and sat cross-legged looking at him with an expression far too serious for a 5-year-old. She said when the clock goes ding ding ding, you have to remember that it's okay. She said I should tell you that she loves you, and she's happy now, and she wants you to be happy too. The words hit Ethan like a physical force, stealing his breath and making his eyes sting with sudden tears. Whether these messages were real or imagined, Sophie clearly believed in them with all her heart, and that belief carried a weight that couldn't be dismissed. "I'll try to be brave," he promised, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I'll try really hard." "Good." Sophie hugged him back, then pulled away with a sudden shift to her usual cheerful energy. "What are you going to wear? You need to look handsome. Miss Victoria will be there." "How do you know Miss Victoria will be there?" "Because she's the boss, Daddy. She has to be at the boss party." Ethan couldn't argue with that logic. He spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation that he tried to hide from Sophie with mixed success. He cleaned the apartment, which didn't need cleaning. He rearranged the books on the shelf, then put them back the way they were. He started and abandoned 3 different meals before finally ordering pizza for lunch. By late afternoon, Sophie had grown impatient with his distracted energy and declared that it was time for him to start getting ready. She supervised from the doorway of his bedroom as he showered and shaved, vetoed his first 2 outfit choices, and finally approved a dark suit with a silver tie that he hadn't worn since Lauren's funeral. "That one," she declared. "You look like a prince." Ethan stared at his reflection in the mirror, seeing a stranger in a suit that suddenly felt too formal, too significant, too weighted with memory. The last time he had worn this suit, he had been saying goodbye to the love of his life. The idea of wearing it to a party felt almost like sacrilege, but Sophie was watching him with those trusting eyes, and she had told him that Mommy wanted him to be happy, and he couldn't disappoint either of them. "Do you think Mommy would approve?" he asked his daughter. Sophie studied him carefully. "Mommy says the tie brings out your eyes." Ethan's breath caught. "She said that, just now, in my head." Sophie tapped her temple. She does that sometimes. Quick little messages like texting, but with thoughts. Before Ethan could process this latest revelation, the doorbell rang announcing Margaret's arrival. His mother-in-law swept into the apartment in a cloud of perfume and purpose-carrying bags filled with activities to keep Sophie entertained. "You look handsome," Margaret said, echoing Sophie's earlier assessment. But there was something complicated in her expression, something that made Ethan wonder what she was really thinking. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, while Sophie ran to examine the contents of the bags. Margaret was silent for a moment. "I'm trying to be," she finally said, using his own words from earlier. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, Ethan. About you, about Sophie, about what Lauren would want. And I've decided that my daughter raised me better than to be selfish." Margaret's eyes were suspiciously bright. "She loved you, Ethan. She loved Sophie before Sophie was even born. And if she's really out there somewhere watching over you both, then she wants you to be happy, even if that means—" She stopped, swallowed hard, and looked away. "Even if that means what? Even if that means letting someone else into your family?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've seen the way you look when you talk about your boss. I've seen the drawings Sophie makes, the ones with 4 people instead of 3. I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. Margaret, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't explain or justify or apologize. Just promise me that whoever she is, she'll be good to my granddaughter. That's all I need to know." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight with guilt and fear for longer than he could remember. "She's good to Sophie," he said quietly. "She's been good to both of us." Margaret nodded once sharply as if deciding something. "Then go to your party. Kiss someone at midnight. Stop punishing yourself for surviving." She said the last words with a ferocity that surprised them both. Then Sophie was running back into the room to show off a new coloring book, and the moment of honesty had passed. But as Ethan drove through the snowy streets toward the downtown hotel, Margaret's words echoed in his mind, alongside Sophie's dream messages and his own tangled emotions. Tonight was going to change something. He could feel it in his bones. The Grand Monarch Hotel had been transformed. Ethan had been to corporate events before, had seen ballrooms decorated for holiday parties, but nothing had prepared him for the spectacle that greeted him when he stepped through the entrance. The vast space seemed to have been touched by some kind of winter magic, every surface sparkling with silver and sapphire decorations that caught the light from enormous crystal chandeliers overhead. The ceiling had been draped with shimmering fabric that gave the impression of a night sky frozen in time, and from it hung hundreds of delicate snowflakes, each one individually crafted and spinning slowly in the gentle air currents. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, offering a view of the city skyline, dusted with snow, the lights of buildings twinkling like earthbound stars against the darkening December sky. A live band played in one corner, their jazz melodies weaving through the crowd like golden threads, and the dance floor in the center of the room was already filled with couples swaying to the music. Champagne towers rose at intervals around the perimeter, tended by servers in crisp white jackets, and the tables scattered throughout were laden with flowers, crystal, and silver that reflected the ambient light in dazzling patterns. The scent of the room was expensive and complex, a blend of perfume and cologne from hundreds of guests, mixed with the subtle sweetness of white roses and the champagne tang of celebration in the air. Everything felt heightened, somehow more significant than a typical corporate event had any right to feel. Ethan accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, grateful for something to do with his hands. The bubbles tickled his nose as he took a nervous sip, and he felt ridiculously out of place among the confident networking crowds that swirled around him. "Ethan, you actually came." A colleague whose name Ethan could never remember appeared at his elbow, clapping him on the shoulder with an enthusiasm that felt slightly too aggressive. "I told everyone you'd show up. You owe me $20, Martinez. Glad I could help your gambling habit," Ethan said dryly, which earned a laugh from the colleague and a few others who had gathered nearby. "The boss is here somewhere," another colleague mentioned, nodding toward the far end of the ballroom. "Looking absolutely stunning, might I add. That red dress should be illegal." Ethan felt his heart rate increase. Has she spoken yet? Not formally, but she's working the room like a pro. All the big clients are here tonight, lots of networking to be done. The colleague winked, though I notice she keeps looking around like she's waiting for someone. Any idea who that might be? Ethan shook his head, but his eyes were already scanning the crowd. The ballroom was packed, filled with hundreds of people in their finest attire, and it should have been impossible to spot one specific person among so many. But when Ethan saw her, it felt inevitable. Victoria stood across the room, surrounded by a group of executives and major clients, and Ethan's breath literally stopped in his chest when he caught sight of her. The dress was crimson red, the color of fresh blood or expensive wine, or the most perfect rose in a winter garden. It fit her like it had been designed specifically for her body, following every curve, with a precision that was somehow both tasteful and breathtaking. The fabric caught the light from the chandeliers and seemed to glow, making her stand out in the crowd like a flame in a field of candles. Her blonde hair had been swept up in an elegant arrangement that revealed the graceful line of her neck and the delicate diamond earrings that dangled just above her bare shoulders. Her makeup was flawless, but subtle, enhancing her features rather than masking them, and even from across the room, Ethan could see the way her green eyes sparkled when she laughed at something one of the executives said. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The thought hit him with the force of a revelation, because it felt true in a way that went beyond physical attraction. Victoria was beautiful, yes, but she was also kind and intelligent and generous, and everything Ethan had trained himself not to want for the past 5 years. She was the future he had convinced himself he didn't deserve, wrapped in a red dress that made his heart race like he was a teenager again. Then, as if she could feel the weight of his gaze, Victoria looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and the noise of the party seemed to fade into something distant and irrelevant. Victoria's smile, which had been professionally charming for the executives, shifted into something softer and more genuine. She said something to the group around her, and then she was walking toward him, moving through the crowd with a confidence that seemed almost choreographed. Ethan forgot how to breathe. "You came," Victoria said, when she reached him, and her voice carried a warmth that cut through all his nervous anticipation. "I promised," he managed, and Sophie insisted. Victoria laughed, and the sound was even more beautiful up close. "Ah, so I have Sophie to thank. How is my favorite junior accountant? She's good. She, actually mentioned you this morning." Ethan knew he was going to say it before the words left his mouth, and he couldn't stop himself. "She said I needed to look handsome because you would be here." Something flickered in Victoria's expression. Smart girl. "She also told me something else." Ethan took a deep breath, remembering Sophie's words from early that morning. She said the stars were going to line up just right tonight. Victoria's smile softened, and for a moment, the CEO mask she wore fell away completely. "Children see things we try to hide," she said quietly. "Don't they?" "What do you mean?" But before Victoria could respond, the company's president appeared at her elbow, apologizing for the interruption, but explaining that several important clients were asking for her specifically. Victoria gave Ethan's arm a brief squeeze, her fingers warm through the fabric of his jacket. "We'll continue this later," she promised, and then she was being guided away toward another group of well-dressed strangers. Ethan watched her go, the ghost of her touch still tingling on his arm. He finished his champagne in one long swallow and reached for another glass from a passing tray. Tonight was going to be a long night. The evening progressed in a blur of conversations Ethan half participated in and connections he didn't quite make. He was pleasant enough shaking hands and making small talk with colleagues he had kept at arm's length for years, but his attention kept drifting toward wherever Victoria happened to be in the room. She was everywhere and nowhere, moving from group to group, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Ethan watched her laugh with board members' charm. Investors praise employees always in control, always perfectly composed. But every so often, her eyes would find his across the room, and something electric would pass between them. By the time the band announced they would be playing a slower set of songs, Ethan had decided it was time to leave. He had made his appearance, had done his duty as a responsible employee, and the prospect of staying until midnight felt suddenly unbearable. Watching couples gather on the dance floor holding each other close as the music swelled, knowing that when the clock struck 12, they would share kisses. While he stood alone, it was too much. It was too painful a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he was too afraid to reach for. He was looking for Victoria to say goodbye when he felt a hand on his arm. Leaving already, Victoria's voice was soft, but something in her tone made him stop. "It's almost midnight." Ethan turned to find her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The confidence of the CEO had softened into something more vulnerable, more uncertain. More like the real Victoria that he had glimpsed in their late-night office conversations. "I should get back to Sophie," he said, but even he could hear how hollow the excuse sounded. Margaret had told him to stay out as late as he wanted. Sophie was probably already asleep. "Your mother-in-law can wait until after midnight." Victoria was still holding his arm, her grip gentle but insistent. The countdown, the kiss. "That's what you're running from, isn't it?" Ethan looked away, embarrassed by how transparent he had become. "It's been 5 years. I still can't watch other couples share that moment. It's too hard." Understanding dawned in Victoria's eyes, and something else. Something that looked like determination. "Dance with me," she said suddenly. "Just one dance before you go." Before Ethan could protest, she was leading him toward the dance floor. The band was playing something slow and romantic, a cover of a song he vaguely recognized about second chances and new beginnings. The irony wasn't lost on him. Victoria turned to face him, guiding his hand to her waist with a naturalness that surprised them both. Her other hand found his, their fingers intertwining, and then they were moving together, swaying to the music in a way that felt far more intimate than any corporate dance floor moment should. "Sophie told me something interesting last week," Victoria said as they danced, "when I dropped off those financial reports at your apartment." Ethan tried to focus on her words rather than the subtle scent of her perfume, the warmth of her body close to his, the way the red dress seemed to shimmer with every movement. What did she say? She said her mommy sent me to take care of you both. Ethan missed a step, nearly tripping over his own feet. She what? Victoria's eyes were gentle, patient, as if she had been preparing for this moment. She said she talks to Lauren sometimes in her dreams, and Lauren told her that she found someone special to look after you until you could all be together again. The blood drained from Ethan's face. I don't know how she knows these things. I've never told her I don't understand where these ideas come from. I think Victoria said softly that it doesn't matter where they come from. What matters is that Sophie believes them, and honestly, part of me believes them too. Victoria, just listen. Please. She pulled him slightly closer, and Ethan could feel her heart beating through the thin fabric of her dress. When Sophie told me that, I went home, and I cried for 3 hours, because a 5-year-old girl saw something I had been trying to hide from everyone, including myself. What do you mean? I mean that I've had feelings for you for longer than I want to admit. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper now, almost lost beneath the music. I've watched you raise your daughter with so much love and determination, and I've watched you carry your grief with a dignity that takes my breath away. And I've fallen in love with you, Ethan. Completely and terrifyingly in love with you. Ethan felt the world shift beneath his feet. Victoria, I know it's complicated. I know you're still grieving. I know I'm your boss, and there are 1,000 professional reasons why this is a terrible idea. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But Sophie says her mother sent me to you, and I have to believe that means something. The music swelled around them, and Ethan became aware of other couples surrounding them, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the confession happening in their midst. The giant clock at the end of the ballroom showed 11:45. 15 minutes until midnight. 15 minutes until the moment he had been dreading. Or maybe 15 minutes until everything changed. The countdown began at 11:59, a murmur rising from the crowd that grew louder as the final seconds of the year ticked away. 10:08. Ethan and Victoria stood at the edge of the dance floor, still close from their dance, still processing the words that had passed between them. Around them, couples were moving together, preparing for the traditional midnight kiss that Ethan had watched from the sidelines for 5 lonely years. 7-6. 5. I can't. Ethan whispered, old fears surfacing like sea monsters from dark water. Victoria, I don't know if I'm ready. What if I hurt you? What if I'm too broken to? 4-3. 2. Victoria reached up and placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. Her eyes held his with an intensity that made his heart stop, and then she leaned close, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered 2 words that changed everything. Kiss me. 1 Happy New Year. The ballroom exploded in cheers and confetti and the popping of champagne corks. Couples all around them came together in kisses that celebrated the turning of the year. And Ethan, frozen in the chaos, stared at Victoria with his heart in his throat. It's okay to live again, she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise. It's okay to be happy. Your daughter told me that her mother wants this for you, and I think you want it too. Ethan thought about Lauren, about Sophie, about 5 years of loneliness and guilt and fear. He thought about Margaret's blessing and Sophie's dreams and the way Victoria had been there through it all, quietly, patiently waiting for him to be ready. And then he stopped thinking. His hands came up to cradle Victoria's face, and he kissed her. The kiss started tentatively, hesitantly, like a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. But when Victoria kissed him back, when she wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed herself against him, the hesitation dissolved into something deeper. Years of loneliness poured into that kiss, years of denied feelings and suppressed hopes, and carefully constructed walls crumbling all at once. Confetti rained down around them, golden and silver in the chandelier light. The band played Auld Lang Syne, and the crowd sang along, and somewhere in the distance, fireworks were exploding over the city skyline. But Ethan was aware of none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in his arms, to the softness of her lips, to the way she tasted like champagne and promises. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying. "I've wanted to do that for 3 years," Victoria admitted, laughing through her tears. Ethan brushed a strand of blonde hair away from her face, marveling at the reality of this moment. "I've been wanting to do that too. I was just too scared to admit it. And now," Ethan looked at her, at this woman who had been patient enough to wait for him, brave enough to risk rejection, kind enough to love not just him, but Sophie too. "Now I'm terrified," he admitted. "But for the first time in 5 years, I'm more excited than scared." Victoria pulled him close again, resting her head against his chest. That's all I needed to hear. They stood there in the middle of the celebration, holding each other as the new year began around them. And somewhere watching from wherever she was, Ethan liked to believe that Lauren was smiling. The drive home at 2 in the morning felt like a dream Ethan was afraid of waking from. His lips still tingled with the memory of Victoria's kiss. His heart still raced every time he replayed the moment in his mind. Everything had changed in the span of a single midnight, and he wasn't sure he knew how to handle it. He let himself into the apartment quietly, expecting to find Margaret asleep on the couch and Sophie in bed. What he found instead was his daughter, sitting on the living room floor in her pajamas, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the door with an expression of determined expectation. Margaret sat in the armchair nearby, looking tired, but unsurprised. Daddy Sophie scrambled to her feet and ran toward him. "You're home! Did you do it? Did you kiss someone at midnight?" Ethan caught her up in his arms, lifting her off the ground and holding her close. "How are you still awake? It's way past your bedtime. I couldn't sleep." Sophie pulled back to look at his face with those knowing eyes that always saw too much. "Mommy said I needed to stay awake for when you got home. She said tonight was going to be special." Ethan glanced at Margaret, who was watching them with a complicated expression. "And was it special?" Margaret asked quietly. "Tonight. Yeah." Ethan's voice cracked on the word. "Yeah, it was." Sophie clapped her hands together in delight. "You kissed Miss Victoria Mommy showed me in my dream. She showed me the red dress and the confetti and everything. She said you were finally brave enough." The words hit Ethan like a wave, and he sat down heavily on the couch, pulling Sophie onto his lap. "How did you know about the red dress? I never told you what Victoria was wearing." "Mommy told me." Sophie said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She shows me things sometimes. She said Miss Victoria looked like a princess, and you looked like a prince, and it was perfect." Margaret made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. When Ethan looked at her, tears were streaming down her face. "I didn't believe it," she whispered. "When Sophie would tell me about her dreams, I thought it was just a child's imagination. But she's been describing things for years, Ethan. Things she couldn't possibly know. Things about Lauren that I never told anyone." "Like what?" "Like the song I sang to Lauren every night when she was a baby. Like the way Lauren used to count the stars before she fell asleep. Like the exact words of the poem I read at her christening." Margaret's voice was shaking. "Sophie told me all of those things, and I never ever mentioned any of them to her." Ethan held his daughter closer, feeling the weight of everything she had carried for them, without fully understanding it. "Sophie, do you know what your dreams mean?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "It means Mommy is still here, just different. She can't hug us, or make cookies, or brush my hair anymore, but she can still talk to me when I sleep, and she can still watch over us and help us find people who will make us happy. And you think Miss Victoria is one of those people. I know she is." Sophie's certainty was absolute. Mommy sent her specially. She said Miss Victoria's heart is lonely too, and we're going to make each other's hearts better. Later that night, after Margaret had gone home and Sophie had finally agreed to sleep, Ethan sat in the living room with his daughter's latest drawing in his hands. She had made it the day before, but had been saving it, she said, for when he got home from the party. The drawing showed 4 people standing together in front of a house. A man with dark hair, a woman with yellow hair in a red dress, a little girl with dark curly hair, and floating above them all, a butterfly with the words, "Mommy watching," written in Sophie's unsteady handwriting. Ethan traced the figures with his finger, marveling at how his daughter had seen the future before it happened. How she had known that Victoria would become part of their family before Victoria and Ethan had even admitted their feelings to each other. "How did you know?" he silently asked the butterfly. "How could you possibly have known that this was what we needed?" The drawing didn't answer. But somewhere in the depths of his heart, Ethan felt a warmth that had been missing for 5 long years. A week after New Year's, Ethan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his collar for the 15th time, and wondering if he had somehow forgotten how to date in the years since Lauren's death. "You look fine, Daddy." Sophie was perched on the edge of the bathtub offering commentary on his preparation with the seriousness of a 5-year-old fashion consultant. "Miss Victoria already likes you. You don't have to be nervous. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to make conversation for 2 hours. Just talk about butterflies. Everyone likes butterflies." Ethan laughed despite his nerves. "I'm not sure that's going to work, but I appreciate the advice." The restaurant Victoria had chosen was a small Italian place in a quieter part of the city, the kind of establishment that relied on word of mouth rather than advertising, and where the owner knew the regular customers by name. Ethan arrived first and secured a corner table, ordering a glass of wine to calm his nerves while he waited. When Victoria walked through the door, he felt his heart skip the same way it had at the party. She wore something simpler tonight, a dark blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked less like a CEO and more like the woman Ethan had come to know through late-night conversations and shared moments. "I've been thinking about what to say all week," Victoria admitted as she sat down across from him. "And now that I'm here, I can't remember any of it." "That makes 2 of us." They ordered food they barely tasted, and wine they sipped more for comfort than pleasure. The conversation started awkwardly, both of them suddenly shy around each other despite everything they had shared at the party. But gradually the words began to flow more naturally. "I should probably tell you something," Victoria said halfway through their appetizers, "about why I was so afraid to admit how I felt about you." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "You can tell me anything." So Victoria told him everything. About Richard and the wedding that never was. About the text message that had humiliated her in front of everyone she knew. About the endometriosis diagnosis and the fertility specialist who had crushed her dreams of having children. About the walls she had built to protect herself and the years she had spent convincing herself that she was better off alone. He said he found someone who could give him what I couldn't. Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. He meant children. He meant I wasn't enough because I couldn't give him the family he wanted. Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling anger rise in his chest on her behalf. He was wrong, was he? Though Victoria's voice was small, in a way Ethan had never heard before. I can't have children, Ethan. At least not biologically. If we go forward with this with us, you need to know that. Sophie is wonderful, and I love her already. But if you wanted more children, Victoria... Ethan interrupted her gently but firmly. I already have a daughter. She's everything I could ever ask for. And if you and I have a future together, it won't be because you can or can't do anything specific. It will be because I love you. Victoria's breath caught. You love me. The words had slipped out before Ethan could stop them, but they felt true in a way that surprised even him. I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it. I love you too. Victoria laughed through the tears that were suddenly streaming down her face. I've loved you since that first day when Sophie showed me her butterfly drawings, and you apologized for her being a distraction. She wasn't a distraction. Neither were you. You were the first thing in years that felt like coming home. They talked for 3 more hours after that, long past the point when their food had gone cold, and their wine glasses had been refilled twice. They talked about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for the future. They talked about Sophie and how any relationship between them would need to center on her well-being. They talked about their professional situation and how they would navigate being in a relationship while Victoria was still technically Ethan's boss. "We'll figure it out," Victoria said finally, as the restaurant began preparing to close. "We'll take it slow. We'll communicate. And we'll put Sophie first, always." "That's all I needed to hear," Ethan said. They walked out into the cold night air, their breath forming clouds that mingled together in the darkness. Ethan turned to Victoria at the corner, where their paths would diverge, taking her hands in his. "Thank you," he said, "for being brave enough to tell me how you felt, for waiting for me to be ready, for loving Sophie even before you loved me." Victoria smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Ethan had ever seen. "Thank you for giving me a reason to believe in love again." He kissed her then, softer than at midnight, but no less meaningful. A promise of things to come. The months that followed moved with a rhythm that felt both new and familiar, as if the three of them had always been meant to find their way to each other. Victoria started coming over for Saturday morning pancakes, a tradition that Sophie insisted on with the same determination she brought to everything else. At first, Victoria sat at the kitchen table like a guest, uncertain of her place in this domestic scene. But Sophie quickly corrected that. "Miss Victoria, you have to help with the butterflies," Sophie declared on the third Saturday, brandishing a butterfly-shaped cookie cutter. "This is butterfly toast, and it's very important." So Victoria stood at the counter next to Sophie, carefully cutting shapes out of bread and learning the precise specifications for what made butterfly toast acceptable. Not too dark, not too soft, with just the right amount of cinnamon sugar on top. "You're doing it wrong," Sophie announced, examining Victoria's efforts with a critical eye. "The wings need to be even. Like this." Victoria adjusted her technique. Sophie studied the result. "Better. You're getting good at this. Daddy used to be terrible, but he practiced a lot." Ethan watched these interactions with a wonder that never quite faded. Victoria, the CEO who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals, taking instruction from a 5-year-old on the proper way to cut bread into butterfly shapes. And more importantly, Victoria genuinely enjoying it, her face lit with a joy that Ethan suspected she had been missing for years. The sleepovers started a few months later, always with Sophie's enthusiastic approval. Sophie would camp out in the living room on those nights, declaring that the floor was more exciting than her bed, and Victoria would tuck her in with a gentleness that made Ethan's heart ache. One night, Sophie woke from a nightmare, the first real nightmare she had experienced in over a year. Ethan and Victoria both heard her cry out and rushed to the living room together, but Sophie reached for Victoria, instinctively burying her face in Victoria's shoulder and clinging to her with desperate little hands. "It was scary," Sophie whimpered. "The butterflies went away, and Mommy couldn't find me." "Shh," Victoria soothed, rocking her gently. "I've got you. The butterflies are still here. Your Mommy can always find you." She began to sing a soft lullaby that Ethan had never heard before, and Sophie's trembling gradually eased. By the time the song ended, Sophie was asleep again, her breathing deep and regular. "What was that song?" Ethan asked quietly, not wanting to wake Sophie. "It was something my mother used to sing to me before she died," Victoria answered. "I haven't thought about it in years. It just came back to me." Ethan found them still there in the morning, Victoria asleep in the makeshift bed with Sophie curled against her side. He stood in the doorway watching them, two of the people he loved most in the world, and felt something settle into place in his heart. This was his family. Unconventional, unexpected, built from broken pieces and brought together by forces he didn't fully understand. But his family nonetheless. If you believe that our loved ones guide us from above, hit that like button. The relationship between a CEO and one of her employees was never going to be simple, and the complications arrived faster than either of them had anticipated. It started with whispers in the break room that fell silent whenever Ethan walked by. Then came the knowing looks, the raised eyebrows, the carefully neutral expressions that were anything but neutral. Ethan's colleagues, who had spent years ignoring him while he struggled through single parenthood, suddenly found him very interesting indeed. I heard she promoted him 3 times last year, someone said loudly enough for Ethan to hear. And they call it merit-based. I heard he started bringing his kid to the office just to get close to her. Can you imagine using your own child like that? The accusation stung more than Ethan wanted to admit. He had worked hard for every promotion, had earned his position through late nights and early mornings, and consistent results. The idea that anyone thought he had traded on Sophie's cuteness to advance his career made him feel sick. When the formal HR complaint arrived, it felt almost inevitable. Anonymous Victoria said, handing him the printed document across her desk, which means it could be anyone. They're alleging that I've shown favoritism toward you, created a hostile work environment for other employees, and used my position to pursue a personal relationship. What do we do? Ethan asked, fear making his voice tighter than he intended. What we should have done from the beginning. Victoria's expression was calm, almost eerily so. We disclosed the relationship officially. We document everything to show that your promotions were merit-based. And we let the chips fall where they may. And if the board decides this is a conflict of interest, what if they ask you to step down? Victoria reached across the desk and took his hand. Then I stepped down. Ethan, I spent years building this career because I thought it was all I would ever have. But now, I have you. I have Sophie. I'm not going to lose you because I'm afraid of what might happen to my job. The disclosure process was formal and excruciating. They sat through hours of meetings with HR, with the board, with legal counsel answering questions about timelines and professional interactions, and the exact nature of their relationship. Ethan's personnel file was scrutinized for any sign of favoritism, and Victoria's decision-making history was examined for bias. In the end, the board ruled that while the relationship was unusual, it did not violate company policy, as long as Ethan's performance reviews were conducted by someone outside Victoria's direct influence. A new structure was implemented, and the gossip gradually died down as the scandal seekers moved on to fresher targets. I'm sorry, Ethan said that night as they sat together on Victoria's couch after a particularly exhausting day of depositions. I never wanted to put your career at risk. Don't apologize. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. You're worth it. This what we have, it's worth everything. Spring arrived with the warmth that always felt like a miracle after long winter months, and with it came Sophie's 6th birthday. Victoria had taken charge of the party, planning, creating a butterfly-themed celebration that exceeded even Sophie's demanding standards. The backyard was decorated with streamers in every color of the rainbow, and Victoria had somehow tracked down a person who specialized in butterfly releases, bringing dozens of monarchs that would be freed at the party's climax. Sophie wore a butterfly crown that Victoria had crafted by hand, and she presided over her kingdom of friends with the benevolent authority of a tiny queen. There were games and cake and presents and singing, and by the time the last guest left, Sophie was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. That was the best birthday ever, she declared, collapsing on the couch next to Victoria. Better than last year. Better than the year before. The best one. I'm glad you liked it, Victoria said, brushing Sophie's dark curls away from her sweaty forehead. You deserve the best birthday ever. Later that night, after the cleanup was done, and Sophie had been bathed and dressed in her favorite pajamas, she appeared in the doorway of the living room where Ethan and Victoria were relaxing. I need to tell you something, Sophie announced with the solemnity that always preceded important declarations. It's about my birthday wish. You're not supposed to tell birthday wishes, Ethan reminded her. They don't come true if you tell. This one's different. It already came true, so I can tell. Sophie climbed onto the couch between them, settling into the space they made for her. I wished for Miss Victoria to stay forever. Victoria's breath caught audibly. Oh, Sophie. And she's staying, so you're right. She's going to be with us forever now. Sophie looked between the two adults with eyes that contained far too much wisdom for her 6 years. Mommy showed me in my dream. She showed me that we were all going to be a family. What exactly did Mommy show you? Ethan asked carefully. Sophie thought about it, her little face scrunched in concentration. She showed me us at Christmas all together around the tree. She showed me Miss Victoria tucking me in at night. She showed me a wedding with flowers and butterflies, and everyone being happy. Sophie looked at Victoria. Can I call you Mommy? Like not instead of Mommy Lauren. She'll always be my angel mommy. But can you be my here mommy, the one who actually hugs me and makes butterfly toast and stays? Victoria was crying openly, now tears streaming down her face as she looked at this child who had claimed her heart from the very beginning. I would love that more than anything, Sophie. If your daddy says it's okay. Sophie turned to Ethan, her eyes pleading. Is it okay, Daddy? Please. Ethan thought about Lauren, about the woman she had been, and the mother she never got to be. He thought about Sophie's dreams, about the messages that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. And he thought about Victoria, who had waited patiently for them, who had loved Sophie before she loved him, who was now being offered the gift she had never expected to receive. Mommy Lauren would want you to have all the love you can get, Ethan said finally. If calling Victoria your here mommy makes you happy, then it makes me happy too. Sophie's shriek of joy nearly deafened them both. She threw herself at Victoria, wrapping her arms around her neck and holding on like she never wanted to let go. I'm going to have 2 mommies, she announced to the universe at large. An angel mommy and a here mommy. That's the best kind of family. And in that moment, watching his daughter embrace the woman he loved, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that Sophie was right. Mother's Day arrived with all the complicated emotions that the holiday had carried since Lauren's death. But this year, there was an additional tension that Ethan could feel building like storm clouds on the horizon. Margaret had invited them for a memorial dinner, as she did every year. They would visit Lauren's grave, leave flowers, share stories about the daughter and mother they had lost. It was a tradition that Ethan had never questioned a way of keeping Lauren's memory alive for Sophie. But when Ethan mentioned that Victoria might join them this year, Margaret's reaction was immediate and intense. Absolutely not. Her voice crackled through the phone with a sharpness that Ethan hadn't heard in months. This is about honoring my daughter. It's not appropriate to bring that woman. Victoria isn't just that woman, Margaret. She's part of our family now. Sophie calls her Mommy Victoria. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I need to process this. Margaret finally said, her voice strangled. We'll talk at dinner. Without her. Ethan arrived at Margaret's house that evening with Sophie, who was clutching a handmade card for her grandmother and a bouquet of daisies that she had insisted on picking herself. Victoria had stayed behind at Ethan's apartment, understanding that some battles needed to be fought before peace could be made. The memorial visit to Lauren's grave was harder than usual. Sophie placed her flowers carefully and talked to her angel mommy about her birthday party, about school, about all the things that had changed in the past year. Margaret stood rigid beside them, her jaw tight and her eyes too bright. It wasn't until they returned to Margaret's house for dinner that the explosion finally came. How could you do this? Margaret's voice cracked like a whip as soon as Sophie had been settled in the living room with cartoons. How could you let some stranger take my daughter's place? No one is taking Lauren's place, Ethan said, fighting to keep his voice calm. Victoria isn't replacing anyone. She's adding to our family, not subtracting from it. She's erasing my daughter. Margaret's composure shattered completely. Sophie calls her Mommy. Do you understand what that means? My Lauren gave her life to bring Sophie into this world, and now Sophie is giving that title away to a woman she's barely known for a year. Sophie has 2 mommies now. That was her choice, and I supported it, because it makes her happy. Happy Margaret laughed bitterly. You're teaching her that people are replaceable. That her mother can just be swapped out for a newer model whenever you feel like moving on. That's not what this is, and you know it. Do I? Margaret stepped closer, her grief transforming into fury. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. It's been barely 6 years since Lauren died, Ethan. 6 years. And you've already moved on to someone new. You've already given your daughter permission to forget her mother. Sophie has never forgotten Lauren. Ethan's own temper was rising now. She talks about Lauren all the time. She dreams about her. She believes that Lauren sent Victoria to us. And honestly, Margaret, I think she might be right. Don't you dare. Margaret's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Don't you dare use my granddaughter's fantasies to justify your affair. Lauren didn't send anyone. Lauren is dead. She's been dead for 6 years, and she doesn't get to have opinions about who you date or who calls themselves Sophie's mother. Maybe not. But I do. And I'm telling you that Victoria is good for Sophie. She's good for me. And I'm not going to apologize for finding happiness again just because it makes you uncomfortable. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint sounds of cartoons from the other room. Margaret stared at Ethan with an expression of profound betrayal, and Ethan stared back with one of determination that he hadn't known he possessed. If she comes to family gatherings, Margaret finally set her voice flat and cold. I won't be there. You'll have to choose. Then I choose Sophie's happiness. Ethan's words felt like stones dropping into still water. And Sophie wants Victoria. If you can't accept that, then you're the one making this choice, not me. He gathered Sophie and her things and drove home in a silence that felt like the aftermath of a war. When Sophie asked why Grandma was so sad, Ethan didn't know how to answer. The business conference in Seattle should have been routine. Victoria had attended dozens like it over the year's events, where industry leaders gathered to network and share insights and jockey for position. She knew the rhythms of these gatherings, intimately knew how to work a room and close a deal and make her presence felt without appearing to try. What she didn't expect was to see Richard. He was standing near the champagne bar, looking exactly as she remembered him. The expensive suit, the confident stance, the charming smile that had once made her believe in forever. Beside him stood a woman with brown hair and a noticeable baby bump, wearing a wedding ring that caught the light whenever she moved. His new wife, his new family, the things he had left Victoria to find. Victoria Richards' voice carried across the room, and she knew there was no escaping without a scene. I heard you made CEO. Congratulations. Thank you. Victoria kept her voice professional, pleasant, revealing nothing. And you must be Melissa. The pregnant woman extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. Richard talks about you sometimes. He says you were brilliant to work with. Victoria forced herself to shake the offered hand, to smile, to play the game. That's kind of him. I was just telling Melissa about your rise through the company, Richard said smoothly. Quite a story, really. Victoria here was always going to be successful. She's the type who doesn't let anything hold her back. The implication was subtle, but unmistakable. Victoria's success was her compensation for what she couldn't have, the career that replaced the family she would never build. I understand you're seeing someone now. Richard continued, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. A widower, I heard. With a daughter. That's right. Interesting choice. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Couldn't find your own family, so you're borrowing someone else's. That's very practical of you, Victoria. Very efficient. The words landed like blows, hitting exactly where they were aimed. Victoria felt her composure cracking, felt the old wounds tearing open, felt every fear she had ever had about her relationship with Ethan suddenly validated by the man who had once promised to love her forever. If you'll excuse me, she managed. I have a session to attend. She didn't make it to the session. She made it to the bathroom, where she locked herself in a stall and cried for 20 minutes, pressing her hands against her mouth to muffle the sounds. When she finally emerged, her makeup was ruined and her confidence was in tatters. She called Ethan's number 3 times, but couldn't bring herself to let it connect. What would she say? That Richard was right. That she was just borrowing someone else's family because she couldn't create her own. That maybe she didn't deserve the happiness she had found. Over the days that followed, Victoria began to pull away. She told herself she was just processing, just needing space, but the truth was that Richard's words had burrowed deep into her psyche and awakened every fear she had ever tried to bury. Maybe she wasn't enough. Maybe she never had been. Maybe she was fooling herself by thinking she could be a real mother to Sophie when she couldn't even have children of her own. The walls she had torn down for Ethan began to rebuild themselves brick by invisible brick. The nightmare came without warning on a Thursday night, exactly 3 weeks after Victoria had attended the conference, and exactly 2 weeks after she had started pulling away from Ethan and Sophie without explanation. In the dream, Ethan was standing in the hospital room where Lauren had died. She was there, too pale and beautiful, dressed in the hospital gown she had worn at the end. But instead of dying, she was sitting up alive, her eyes fixed on him with an expression of profound disappointment. "You promised," Lauren whispered. "You promised to love me forever." "I do love you," Ethan said in the dream. "I never stopped loving you, but you love her now." Lauren's face twisted with pain. "You've given her my daughter. You've let Sophie call her mommy. You've replaced me. That's not true. That's not what this is." "Forever," Lauren repeated. And now she was fading, dissolving, her voice becoming fainter with every word. "You said forever, but forever only lasted 6 years. Ethan woke, gasping, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. The sheets were soaked with sweat, and his hands were shaking when he raised them to wipe his face. It was just a dream. Lauren wasn't angry. Lauren had sent Victoria to them. Sophie had said so dozens of times. The dreams Sophie described were loving, supportive, full of blessing. So why did Ethan suddenly feel like he had betrayed everything he had ever promised? The guilt that had been lurking at the edges of his consciousness for months suddenly flooded through him with overwhelming force. What if he was wrong? What if Sophie's dreams were just dreams? A little girl's imagination creating comfort where none existed. What if he had been using his daughter's fantasies to justify his own desires? And Victoria. Victoria had been so distant lately, so withdrawn. She canceled plans, made excuses, spoke to him in that professional tone she hadn't used since they first started dating. Was she having doubts too? Had she realized that this relationship was too complicated, too messy, too weighted with ghosts and obligations? Maybe he should let her go. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if he just went back to being alone, back to the safe isolation he had built around himself and Sophie. Maybe happiness was too much to ask for. He called Victoria the next morning and asked if they could meet for lunch. They sat across from each other at a small cafe near the office, and Ethan studied Victoria's face for signs of what she was feeling. She looked tired, he realized. Tired and sad in a way she hadn't been since the early days of their relationship. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "You've been pulling away, and I think I know why." "Ethan, I had a nightmare last night. About Lauren." He forced himself to continue despite the pain of the words. "She told me I was betraying her, that I had replaced her, and I woke up thinking maybe she was right." Victoria's face went pale. "Oh, Ethan, I think maybe we've been moving too fast." The words tasted like poison in his mouth, but he made himself say them. "Maybe I'm not as ready as I thought I was. Maybe I'm still too broken to—" "Stop!" Victoria's voice was sharp, cutting through his self-flagellation. "Just stop. Victoria, I've been pulling away because I saw my ex at the conference. Richard." She spat the name like a curse. "He said things. Cruel things about how I couldn't find my own family, so I was borrowing yours. And I believed him. I let him convince me that I don't deserve what we have." Ethan stared at her, processing this new information. "Your ex-fiancé, the one who left you at the altar, the one who told me I wasn't enough because I couldn't give him children. He's married now. His wife is pregnant. Victoria laughed bitterly. He was there with his perfect family, and he made me feel like everything I've built with you and Sophie is just pretend, just borrowed, just temporary. Victoria, that's not true, isn't it? Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can't give you more children, Ethan. What if someday you wake up and realize you want that? What if you regret being with someone who can't give you a bigger family? I don't want more children. I have Sophie. She's enough. You're enough. Ethan reached across the table and took her hands. Victoria, listen to me. You are not borrowing my family. You are part of my family. Sophie loves you. I love you. And no ex-boyfriend with a complex has the right to tell you otherwise. But your nightmare was just a nightmare, probably because I was feeling guilty about how happy I've been. Ethan squeezed her hands. The real Lauren, the one Sophie sees in her dreams, wants this for us. She sent you to us. Remember, Sophie says it all the time. Victoria was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks in a way she never allowed in public. I've been so stupid. I've been letting him win, letting his words poison everything we've built. Then stop letting him win. Ethan's voice was firm. Stop running. Stop building walls. Let me love you, Victoria. Let Sophie love you. Let us prove that you deserve exactly what we have. They sat there in that cafe for a long time, holding hands across the table, while Victoria cried, and Ethan offered silent comfort. The lunch crowd came and went around them, but they barely noticed. I'm sorry, Victoria finally said, her voice hoarse. I'm sorry for pulling away. I'm sorry for making you doubt what we have. Don't be sorry. Just come home. 3 weeks of misery had taken their toll on everyone. But Sophie bore the weight most visibly. She stopped eating properly, pushing food around her plate with listless disinterest. She stopped drawing butterflies, her markers sitting untouched in their box. Worst of all, she stopped dreaming about her mother. Mommy's gone quiet, Sophie whispered to Margaret during one of her grandmother's visits. I can't hear her anymore. Margaret, who had been watching her granddaughter's decline with growing concern, felt something crack open in her chest. What do you mean, sweetie? She used to talk to me in my dreams every night. She showed me things and told me things and made me feel better when I was sad. Sophie's voice was small and hollow. But now when I sleep, she's not there. It's just dark and quiet and lonely. Margaret thought about everything she had said to Ethan, all the accusations she had hurled, all the ultimatums she had made. She had been so focused on her own grief, her own sense of betrayal, that she hadn't stopped to consider what her anger was doing to the people she claimed to love. Sophie wasn't eating. Sophie wasn't creating. Sophie wasn't dreaming. And now Margaret understood why. I need to talk to your daddy, Margaret said quietly. Can you stay with the cartoons for a little while? She found Ethan in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked as terrible as Sophie did, dark circles under his eyes, and a weariness in his posture that went beyond physical exhaustion. Something's happened to her, Ethan said before Margaret could speak. To Victoria. She's pulling away, and I don't know why. And Sophie's dreams have stopped, and I'm scared it means something. Margaret sat down across from her son-in-law, the man she had blamed for surviving when her daughter didn't, the man she had accused of betrayal for daring to find happiness again. Looking at him now, she saw only a father who loved his daughter and was terrified of failing her. I've made terrible mistakes, Margaret said quietly. I said things to you that were cruel and unfair. I was so angry about losing Lauren that I couldn't see anything else. Margaret, let me finish. Please. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what needed to be said. When Sophie was born, when Lauren died, I blamed the baby. Not consciously, not intentionally, but somewhere deep down, I resented this tiny person who had lived while my daughter hadn't. I spent years trying to love Sophie, while also trying not to hate her, and it nearly destroyed both of us. Ethan's expression had shifted from weariness to something like understanding. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. I hid it. I buried it so deep that I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. Margaret's voice cracked. And then you found Victoria, and Sophie started calling her mommy, and all that buried resentment came flooding back. I wasn't angry about Lauren being replaced. I was angry about finally having to let her go. She reached across the table and took Ethan's hand, a gesture she had rarely offered since the early days of his marriage to her daughter. Lauren would want you happy. I've known that all along, but I couldn't admit it, because admitting it felt like admitting that she's really gone, that she's never coming back, that my daughter, my baby girl, is just gone. The tears came then, for both of them. Tears that had been waiting years to fall. I want you to be happy, Ethan. I want Sophie to be happy. And if Victoria is part of that happiness, then I need to stop standing in the way. Margaret squeezed his hand. Go get her. Fix whatever's broken. Bring her back to this family. Ethan stared at his mother-in-law, at this woman who had been more enemy than ally for years, and felt something heal between them that he hadn't known was wounded. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Margaret. Victoria was in her office when Ethan arrived, buried behind a stack of reports that she had been using as a shield against the world. The professional mask was firmly in place, the CEO armor that protected her from everything that might hurt her. We need to talk, Ethan said, closing the door behind him. I'm in the middle of something. Victoria didn't look up from her papers. Can this wait? No, it can't. Something in his tone made her finally meet his eyes, and what she saw there made her set down her pen. Sophie stopped dreaming about Lauren, Ethan said quietly. It happened around the same time you started pulling away. She told my mother-in-law that her mommy has gone quiet, that she can't hear her anymore. Victoria's facade cracked slightly. That's not because of me, isn't it? Ethan stepped closer to her desk. Sophie believes that Lauren sent you to us. She believes that her mother is watching over us and guiding us toward happiness. And when you started withdrawing, when you let Richard's words poison what we have, Sophie lost her connection to her mother. Ethan, that's not fair. You can't put that on me. I'm not putting anything on you. I'm telling you what's happening. Ethan's voice softened. I'm telling you that your choice to pull away has consequences that go beyond you and me. We're a family, Victoria, whether you feel ready to accept that or not. What you do affects all of us. Victoria stood abruptly, moving to the window, where she could look out at the city skyline without meeting his eyes. I told you what Richard said. I told you how it made me feel. You did. And I told you he was wrong. Ethan came to stand beside her. But here's what you haven't told me. What do you want? Not what you're afraid of, not what you think you deserve, but what you actually want. Victoria was silent for a long moment, her jaw tight with the effort of holding back emotion. I want Sophie to call me mommy, without it feeling like I'm stealing something that isn't mine. I want to wake up next to you without wondering if you're comparing me to Lauren. I want to stop being afraid that everything we have is going to be taken away because I'm not enough. You are enough. Ethan took her hand, turning her to face him. You have been enough since the first day Sophie showed you her butterfly drawings, and you knelt down to her level and really listened. You were enough when you cried over a child's birthday card, and pretended you weren't. You were enough when you sang my daughter to sleep with a lullaby from your own mother. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Victoria Hayes. I am not with you because you're convenient or available, or because you remind me of Lauren. I'm with you because you are extraordinary, because you make me better, because you love my daughter like she's your own. And that is not borrowing or pretending or being second best. That is just love. Victoria's tears finally broke free, streaming down her face as her walls came tumbling down. Last night, she whispered Sophie's dream came back. She texted me this morning. She said her mommy Lauren was there again, and she had a message. What was the message? Go bring her home. Victoria laughed through her tears. A 6-year-old texted me at 7 a.m. with a message from her dead mother telling me to come home. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she cried against his chest. Then come home. Stop running. Stop hiding. Come home to me and Sophie and let us prove that you belong with us. I'm scared, Victoria admitted, her voice muffled against his shirt. I know. I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. Victoria pulled back to look at him, her makeup ruined and her professional armor completely gone. What remained was just Victoria, the real Victoria, the woman who had been waiting her whole life for someone to see her exactly as she was and choose her anyway. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll come home. Fall arrived in a blaze of color that seemed almost choreographed, as if the universe had decided to dress itself up for what was about to happen. The trees along the city streets turned gold and crimson and amber, and the air carried that particular autumn crispness that made everything feel new and possible. Ethan had been planning for weeks, coordinating with Sophie in whispered conversations and secret meetings that made his daughter feel very important and grown up. The ring had been purchased months ago, hidden in the back of his sock drawer, waiting for the right moment. The right moment they had finally decided was the anniversary of their first kiss. We're going back to the hotel, Victoria asked when Ethan told her about the dinner reservation. The same hotel as last New Year's. The same ballroom, actually. They're hosting a private event that night, and I pulled some strings to get us a table. Victoria smiled, touching his face with gentle fingers. You're a romantic, Ethan Harper. Who knew? Sophie knew. She's been helping me plan. The ballroom looked different in autumn than it had in winter, decorated now in warm golds and deep burgundies rather than silver and sapphire. But the chandeliers still sparkled, and the windows still framed a spectacular view, and the space still carried the weight of everything that had happened there almost a year ago. Victoria noticed the photographs first. They were arranged around the room, dozens of them, documenting the journey that had brought them to this moment. There was the first photo of Sophie showing Victoria her butterfly drawings captured on someone's phone and printed large enough to see every detail. There was Victoria at Sophie's birthday party, covered in frosting, and laughing harder than Ethan had ever seen. There was the three of them at the beach last summer, building a sandcastle that kept collapsing while Sophie shrieked with delight. Memory after memory, moment after moment, arranged like stations of the cross leading toward an altar at the center of the room. Ethan! What is this? Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, Sophie appeared from behind one of the photo displays. She was wearing a princess dress that she had insisted on, complete with a small tiara that caught the light. In her hands, she held a sign decorated with butterflies and hearts, the words written in her best first-grader handwriting. Will you be my mommy forever? Victoria's hands flew to her mouth, tears already forming. Sophie. Ethan stepped forward, taking her hands in his, kneeling before her on one knee, the way he had imagined doing 1,000 times. Victoria Hayes. He set his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him a year ago. You asked me to kiss you at midnight. You were brave enough to take a risk that terrified you, and you changed my life forever. He pulled the ring box from his pocket, opening it to reveal the simple, elegant diamond he had chosen, with Sophie's enthusiastic assistance. I've spent the past year falling more in love with you every single day. I've watched you become a mother to my daughter. I've learned what it means to be part of something bigger than myself. And I've realized that I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me. Sophie had moved to stand beside him, still holding her sign, her little face glowing with excitement. Victoria, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Sophie's mommy forever and always? Victoria was crying too hard to speak, but she was nodding emphatically, her whole body trembling with the force of her joy. Yes, she finally managed to whisper. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms. Sophie joined them immediately, wrapping her arms around both their waists and squealing with delight. She said yes. She said yes. Sophie chanted, bouncing with excitement. Mommy Lauren told me she would. She showed me in my dream last Christmas. Victoria laughed through her tears, pulling Sophie closer. Your Mommy Lauren is pretty smart, you know that? I know. Sophie beamed up at both of them. She said you're all going to be really, really happy. And she said she's proud of you, Daddy, for being brave enough to love again. Ethan felt the words pierce his heart in the best possible way. He looked at the woman who would become his wife, at the daughter who had guided them together, and he felt something that had been missing for 6 long years finally click into place. He was home. The engagement period was surprisingly peaceful, filled with wedding planning and family dinners, and the gradual weaving together of lives that had been separate for too long. Margaret surprised everyone by becoming Victoria's most enthusiastic wedding ally. She arrived at the apartment one afternoon with bridal magazines and fabric samples declaring that she intended to help with every detail of the ceremony. When Victoria expressed surprise at her involvement, Margaret took her hands with a gentleness that neither of them expected. My daughter is gone, Margaret said quietly. Nothing will ever change that. But you're here, and you love my granddaughter, and you've made my son-in-law smile in a way I thought he'd forgotten how to. I'm choosing to be grateful for that, rather than resentful about what we've lost. The two women had embraced tears, mixing as walls came down and bridges were built. Sophie, meanwhile, had embraced her role as wedding consultant with all the intensity of a 6-year-old who had been dreaming about this moment for years. She had strong opinions about flowers. Butterflies were essential about colors, nothing boring, and about music. The song from her favorite movie had to be included somehow. Mommy Lauren says there should be butterfly releasing, Sophie announced one evening during a wedding planning session. She says the butterflies will carry messages to heaven, and everyone who's watching from up there will know we're happy. Victoria looked at Ethan, a question in her eyes. Butterfly releasing it, as Ethan confirmed. As the wedding date approached, Victoria felt the need to do something that she hadn't done since this all began. She asked Ethan and Sophie to take her to Lauren's grave. They went on a sunny afternoon in late spring when the cemetery was lush with new growth and the air smelled of flowers and fresh-cut grass. Sophie led the way, chattering about what she planned to tell her angel mommy, while Ethan and Victoria followed hand in hand. Lauren's headstone was simple and elegant, her name and dates carved into gray marble with a small butterfly etched beneath the inscription. Sophie immediately began arranging the flowers they had brought, speaking to her mother in a steady stream of updates about school and friends and the upcoming wedding. Victoria hung back at first, uncertain of her place in this intimate moment. But then Sophie turned and reached for her hand, pulling her forward to kneel beside the grave. "This is Mommy Victoria," Sophie told the headstone seriously. "She's going to marry Daddy and be my here mommy. I know you already know her because you sent her to us, but I wanted you to meet her properly." Victoria felt tears burning in her eyes. "Hello, Lauren," she said softly. "I never got to meet you, but I feel like I know you through Sophie and Ethan. They talk about you all the time, and I can see pieces of you in both of them." She paused, gathering her courage. "I want you to know that I'm not trying to replace you. I never could, and I never want to. You're Sophie's mother in ways that I can never be, and Ethan loved you in a way that will always be part of him. What I'm offering is different, not more or less, just different." Sophie squeezed her hand encouragingly. "I promise to love your daughter with everything I have. I promise to keep your memory alive for her, to make sure she knows how much you wanted her, how much you loved her, even before you met her. And I promise to love Ethan in a way that honors what you shared together, building on the foundation you created, rather than trying to erase it." A butterfly appeared from nowhere, a vivid blue morpho that had no business being in this part of the country in this season. It circled their heads once, twice, 3 times, then landed briefly on Sophie's outstretched hand before fluttering away toward the sun. Mommy Lauren says, "Thank you." Sophie whispered, her eyes following the butterfly's flight. She says she's happy now. She says we all are. Ethan put his arm around Victoria's shoulders, pulling her close while Sophie continued to watch the sky where the butterfly had disappeared. "Thank you," Ethan whispered in Victoria's ear. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for everything." The garden venue had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with white flowers cascading from every surface and butterflies everywhere, real ones fluttering through the air and decorative ones adorning the tables and hanging from delicate threads along the aisle. Victoria stood in the bridal suite wearing an elegant white gown that Margaret had helped her choose, looking at her reflection in the mirror and trying to believe that this was really happening. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, making a final adjustment to Victoria's veil. Lauren would have approved. "You think so? I know so." Margaret's eyes were bright with emotion. She would have been grateful that Sophie has someone like you, and she would have been happy that Ethan found love again. The ceremony itself was small and intimate, just family and close friends gathered in the golden afternoon light. Ethan stood at the altar watching the entrance with an expression of barely contained anticipation, while Sophie took her place as flower girl, dressed in a miniature version of Victoria's gown, with a butterfly crown perched on her dark curls. When Victoria appeared, Ethan's breath caught the way it had a year ago in the New Year's ballroom. She was radiant, glowing with a happiness that seemed to light up everything around her. As she walked toward him, their eyes met and held speaking volumes that words could never capture. The vows were personal and powerful. Ethan began, his voice steady. "Despite the tears in his eyes, I spent 5 years believing that love was something that happened once, that my heart had reached its capacity, and there was no room for more. You proved me wrong. You taught me that love isn't finite. It grows. It expands. It makes room for everyone who deserves to be there." He took her hands in his. "I vow to love you through every challenge and every celebration. I vow to support your dreams and dry your tears and laugh at your jokes, even when they're not that funny. And I vow to spend every day showing you that you are enough, you are worthy, and you are exactly what Sophie and I need." Victoria's tears were falling freely now, but she was smiling. "Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I came into your life, carrying wounds I thought would never heal. I had convinced myself that I would always be alone. That family was something that happened to other people, that I would never be anyone's first choice. You and Sophie changed everything." She glanced at Sophie, who was watching with rapt attention. "I vow to love you with a love that honors the past while embracing the future. I vow to be the partner you deserve, the mother Sophie needs, and the woman who makes your house a home. And I vow to spend every day proving that Lauren was right, that I was meant to find you, and that what we have is exactly what it was always supposed to be." Sophie's addition to the ceremony came next. She stepped forward, her little face serious with the importance of what she was about to do. "I have something from Mommy Lauren," she announced, reaching into the small basket she had carried down the aisle. Inside were dozens of tiny butterflies made from tissue paper and attached to transparent strings. Sophie began releasing them one by one, and as they caught the breeze, they rose into the air like a shower of colored confetti swirling around the couple and their guests. "Mommy Lauren says congratulations," Sophie declared. "She says the butterflies are carrying her love to both of you, and she says she's proud of us for finding each other." The kiss that sealed their vows was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the loneliness that had defined both their lives, and a beginning to everything that would come next. The reception that followed was filled with joy, with laughter, with toasts that made everyone cry, and dances that made everyone smile. But the moment Ethan would remember forever came during their first dance as husband and wife, when Sophie ran onto the dance floor and demanded to be included. The three of them swayed together, a family unit at last, while the band played and the guests watched with tears in their eyes. "I love you, Daddy," Sophie whispered, her arms wrapped around both of them. "And I love you, Mommy Victoria." "I love you too, sweetheart," Victoria replied. "Forever and always." 1 year exactly since the kiss that changed everything, Ethan and Victoria found themselves back in the Grand Monarch Hotel ballroom for the company's New Year's Eve party. But everything was different now. Victoria wore red again, a deliberate callback to the dress that had stopped Ethan's heart. But this time, a wedding band glinted on her finger alongside the engagement ring. Sophie wore a miniature red dress that she had insisted on declaring that she wanted to match her Mommy Victoria. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Victoria said, looking around the same room where their story had really begun. "And also like yesterday." "Both things are true," Ethan agreed, pulling her close. "Time is funny that way." The countdown began, the familiar numbers that had once filled Ethan with dread, now carrying only excitement and gratitude. 10, 9, 8. Sophie bounced between them, too excited to stand still. 7, 6, 5. Ethan thought about everything that had led to this moment. The grief and the healing, the fear and the courage, the walls that had been torn down and the bridges that had been built. 4, 3, 2. Victoria smiled up at him, her green eyes reflecting the ballroom lights, full of love and happiness and complete certainty. "One happy new year." They kissed as the confetti fell. Sophie squeezed between them, giggling at the tickle of paper on her skin. "Thank you," Victoria whispered when they finally broke apart. "Thank you for kissing me back 1 year ago." "Thank you for being brave enough to ask," Ethan replied. Sophie tugged on both their hands, demanding attention. "Mommy Lauren says, 'Happy New Year.' She says this year is going to be even better than last year." Ethan and Victoria looked at each other over their daughter's head, seeing the same joy and gratitude reflected in each other's eyes. "I believe her," Victoria said softly. The three of them stood together as the new year began, confetti raining down around them, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had witnessed their journey from tragedy to triumph. And somewhere above, watching with a mother's love that transcended even death, a butterfly spread its wings and soared. The family portrait hanging above the fireplace had grown since that first New Year's kiss. Ethan and Victoria stood in the center, their arms around each other, looking at the camera with the easy happiness of a couple who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. Beside them, Sophie had grown into an 11-year-old, with her mother's dark curls and her father's determined chin. And in Victoria's arms, a 3-year-old girl with blonde hair and green eyes smiled her gap-toothed smile. Hope Harper adopted at birth from a teenage mother who had chosen the couple specifically because of their story, because she wanted her daughter to be raised by people who understood that family wasn't defined by biology, but by love. "Mommy Lauren says Hope has her eyes," Sophie announced one evening, studying her baby sister with the serious attention of an older sibling. "She says Hope was always supposed to be part of our family, just like you were." "Mommy Victoria." Victoria smiled, still amazed after all these years by Sophie's dreams and the comfort they brought. The dreams continued, though less frequently, now appearing at moments when guidance was needed or reassurance was sought. Lauren remained a presence in their lives, not as a ghost, but as a guardian, watching over the family she had helped create. Margaret had become the grandmother she was always meant to be. Doting on both girls equally, her complicated grief transformed into uncomplicated love. She visited every Sunday for dinner, taught Sophie to bake Lauren's favorite recipes, and told stories about the daughter she had lost, until that daughter felt as real to Hope as she did to Sophie. Ethan had been promoted to CFO of Pinnacle Marketing, working alongside Victoria as equals rather than as boss and employee. They had found a balance that worked for them, leaving the office at the office and coming home to the chaos and joy of family life. And when Sophie asked one night if she could stop dreaming about Mommy Lauren, if it was okay to let those conversations fade, Lauren herself had provided the answer. Mommy says she'll always be there when I need her. Sophie reported the next morning. But she says I don't need her as much anymore. I have enough mommies now. The family portrait included one more element just visible at the edge of the frame. A small butterfly painted in vivid blue with the words "Always Watching" written beneath it in Lauren's handwriting, copied from the last birthday card she had ever given Ethan. Love multiplies. It never divides. Friends, if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love never truly dies, and that second chances are possible at any age, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel family for more stories that restore your faith in love in family and in the extraordinary power of human connection. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to love again, that grief and joy can exist side by side, that the heart has an infinite capacity for growth. And tell us in the comments, do you believe our loved ones guide us from above? Have you experienced moments that felt like messages from beyond your story matters? We would love to hear it. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is whisper, "Kiss me," to the person who's too afraid to ask. And sometimes the bravest response is to say yes.